All right, everybody. So welcome to this final main stage panel for today. It's entitled AI Accountability in the Public Sector. So basically, I want to, just to get started, relate back to what we heard just in the morning for the first panel. So this was really about the big blind spots in responsible AI, right? Like we talked about the very profit-driven mindset of the frontier AI leaders, especially in the US. We talked about the liability question and how it gets diffused, especially once we move from generative AI to agentic AI, discussed the psychological impacts of AI systems. So also the big questions of global competition, the AI race between the powerhouses, US and China, but also between the tech companies, and what that means for the political economy of AI safety, right? Like those big questions. What we want to do now is zoom in on the public sector, so basically look at the role of public institutions and basically their role in defining what public interest AI means, defining who sits at the table when we negotiate this, but also look at how does the public sector actually operationalize human-centric AI principles, AI ethics in their own AI deployments. So for this, I introduce my fellow co-moderator Dalia Ali, also from TUM, and our wonderful panelists. So we have Laura Crompton, Caitlin Corrigan, and Oxane Boch. And I would like you to introduce yourselves, actually, and just maybe highlight the most important parts about your profile, what you would like the audience to know. And I would also be interested in learning like what motivates you to be in this field, specifically working at the intersection of AI and human rights, AI ethics, but also public accountability. So Laura, maybe you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, so thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to be part of this panel, so thank you for the invitation. So I'm Laura, I'm a professor at Technische Hochschule Ingolstadt, THI, since September last year, so still pretty new and fresh. I am an AI ethicist. I am a philosopher by training and did philosophy of technology from the very beginning, so in my bachelor's, master's, and during my PhD. I moved from robot philosophy to AI ethics in particular with my PhD. And after the PhD, I went on to work at BITE, the Bavarian Agency of Digital Affairs, because I thought I had had enough of academia. It turns out I was wrong. At BITE, BITE is basically an in-house consultancy agency from the Bavarian ministries for the Bavarian ministries. So what we did is consult the Bavarian ministries on digitalization topics. So whenever a ministry wanted to do a digitalization project, they came to BITE, and we basically helped them to put this project into life. And that basically is also the motivation why I wanted to move on into the topic of AI ethics in and for the public sector, because in this work at BITE, I saw that, so I started as a project manager on like process analysis, so very, very different topic, and then ChatGPT came around the corner, and suddenly all Bavarian ministries jumped into, oh, we need AI and we need Gen AI no matter what. We need it for, many of you maybe know the Seepferdchen, which is like a swimmer's like test you have to do, or you can do as a child, as a kid. And the Ministry of Interior Affairs in Bavaria said, oh, we need it. It's really important that we have an AI driven chatbot that can help parents with questions around the Seepferdchen. And it's like things like that where I said, you know what, I think we have more important questions to address in this state. So, and this is why I think that this topic is incredibly important, to kind of make sure that AI is implemented in a meaningful manner and not just for the sake of it.
Thanks. Hi, so my name is Caitlin Corrigan, and I'm the Managing Director of the Munich Center for Transformative Technologies and Societal Change. And until recently, I was the Managing Director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. So I kickstarted some of what you're doing here today and then passed it off into very capable hands. I'm really excited to be here today. What brought me to this topic? My background is in public policy and international affairs, so I've been engaging with kind of how do we drive societal change, how do we drive societal development for a long time, and it's hard to kind of think about these questions without thinking about the power of technology and the power of AI at the moment. More recently, I've been looking at this through the lens of, first of all, how the role of human rights is changing in this context, but also what this means for things like gender equality and other marginalized populations. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that during this session.
Absolutely, fantastic. Oksane, you want to go next?
So hi, I'm Oksane. I think you've seen me a lot today already, but now I'm going to do a bit of content. So why I ended up in talking about this kind of topics is first we started talking about accountability a long time ago. We started working on the concept of accountability. What does it mean for companies? What are we really talking about? And then expanding it to companies, from companies to public sector seems to be really important, as the example you were giving earlier, right? Yeah, we need to have a meaningful implementation. Also, I think when we talk about accountability, when we talk about public interest, the definition of the term public interest is pretty broad, we were talking this morning about values. I think that's also how we need to address public interest. What do we benchmark as being public interest? What do we mean? And through my work at Women in AI, we've spoken a lot about the issues relating to gender as well. Also integrating AI in NGOs, right, which is for public interest, but how, why, all of that, and all the biases that come with that. So there's many different angles of interest for me in this discussion, basically.
Fantastic. So what we will do is now, first look at, the question of defining public interest and the role that public institutions play in there, and then on the second half, move into accountability mechanisms, operationalization of especially also human rights mechanisms in the public sector, but also ask the question, how can public institutions, leverage the field between global, for example, human rights standards on AI, but also context-sensitive governance approaches. So with that, I pass on to Dalia for the first round.
Thank you so much. Firstly, we want to clarify that it wasn't intentionally this panel led by women. But once Beyonce said that who runs the world? Girls. So I'll just start with the warm-up question, and I'll start with you, Kathleen. So it's often assumed that public interest and the market incentives are fundamentally misaligned. And the public institutions, therefore, have a unique responsibility in shaping AI governance. So drawing on your experience and also your work in the intersection between science, ethics, and also institutions, including your work with UNESCO, what do you see as a specific role of public institutions in advancing AI to serve the public interest?
Thank you for that. I think it's important to think about maybe the additional kind of thoughts and considerations that the public sector has to put into how it engages with the topic of AI. And it has two really big roles. One is to be a deployer or a user and then deployer of AI systems. And in this, it has to think about, maybe more so than in other contexts, the transparency in these systems, how to make sure we're bringing everyone in. The fact that if you're going to employ AI systems in the public sector, there may be a different level of actually ability to opt out or opt into these systems than in using them in other contexts. So we have to make sure that there are alternatives for those who don't want to opt into these systems. And so there's kind of those added extra considerations that need to go into using AI, to deploying AI in public services in that sense. And the additional kind of democratic mechanisms that need to go along this, even if it kind of changes the process or slows down the process or makes the process more complex. I think there's that added responsibility there. On the other side, the government or public sector is also a shaper and supporter of an AI ecosystem. And there I think there's several roles that that public sector has a responsibility to play, particularly in how it supports who gets to be in that ecosystem, right? And how it brings in, again, I was talking about marginalized populations into that process in a way that maybe the current way that our, for instance, venture capital or other market mechanisms are not set up to bring in those voices as much. On the other side, it can play a big role in funding. So supporting training for making a more inclusive ecosystem, supporting actually funding initiatives that are public interest oriented or that get at problems in society that maybe the private sector is not set up or motivated to take on because they maybe don't have the same profit generating mechanisms. So those are the ways that the public sector, I think, can get involved and also has extra responsibility to get involved.
Also, where do you think governments are currently falling short?
Well, I can give most examples, many of the examples I can give are from my work with UNESCO. So working with the Women for Ethical AI, which is powered by UNESCO. I was working with them last year to work on an outlook on gender equality in AI. And what we did is look through essentially as many as we could get our hands on of different AI governance documents, declarations, protocols, guidelines that countries had put out, mostly at the country level we were looking. And while the majority are, I would say the majority are at least some way talking about issues like gender diversity, sustainability, some of these other issues that you think might not always pop up, they're mentioning them there. And they're saying, yes, this is important. We have to make sure AI bias isn't a thing. We have to make sure that people are treated equally. We have to make sure that AI promotes gender equality instead of increasing the gaps. But they don't put anything beyond that, right? They just say, yes, this is important, and we acknowledge that this is important. The next step that needs to come is, like I said, funding for shaping this ecosystem, putting real financial commitment and decision-making commitment behind it so that we can take the next step and say, okay, now how can you shape and shift what we're obviously seeing with tangible kind of budgets? And we have very, very few, in fact, I can't think of any that we found of where they've committed, this is how much we're going to spend on this, or this is how much we spent on this last year. And that's really where the gap is coming.
Awesome. Turning to you, Oksana. So you are the Women in AI in Germany ambassador. So in AI governance today, from your perspective, who is actually defining what counts as public interest, and what is the cost of those exclusion for legitimacy and also for accountability?
So who's defining, if that's the first part of the question, right? Fear, I think, is defining, if you ask me. Of course, you have people that are defining, and those people, as we've discussed a lot throughout the day, and funnily with this panel, we're kind of countering this, are usually from a homogeneous group. Even though it's getting better, and actions like Women in AI, but also Women at the Table in Geneva, are supporting this change. I think the problem is the skewed population. Everyone can agree about that, of who's defining and for whom. I think we don't have a good definition of the for whom either, right? So you were talking about marginalized groups. I think that, again, this is kind of not really integrated. The following parts of the question where who defines?
The following part, what is the cost of those exclusions?
Mm-hmm. The discussions we have today. Well, I think that there are efforts, right, on changing who's discussing this and who's taking part. Also, I don't see a lot of scientists taking part, even going further than gender and minorities, talking about people that are in labs, study things, observe things. We talk a lot about science-informed policy. From my short experience, I haven't seen that a lot. I have seen fear-informed policy, I've seen hype-informed policy, but not science, data, hard, what is actually happening in foreign policy, and that links back to the psychological impact work that I'm doing, right? And so I think that you leave out most of the people when you do that, and that includes literally everyone, not just the marginalized groups. You leave out the real problem if you do that, because you don't fix it with policy. You're fixing a fake problem, and therefore you're not actually enhancing anything, right? And so I think the public sector is doing that overall, even though there is, of course, a lot of efforts to do better. But when I read in, for instance, the AI Act, we're against manipulation, Great, define manipulation for me, please. Give me, what do we mean? Manipulation is actually a neutral term in psychology. So harmful manipulation, okay, define this, right? So anyway, that's where, for me, the big issue is also in the understanding of the terms we use to define what, to help with what, and when it comes to accountability, we can't really, therefore, be transparent about what we do.
Awesome. Also, do you think the psychological safety can act as a foundation for inclusive design, AI design?
I do believe so, yes. In psychology, we have a lot of different methodologies. We can debate about those for days, of course, but we have a lot of different methodologies to evaluate roughly everything about humans, behaviors, emotions, cognitions. Of course, we have lacks and missing, and you will always have bias and gaps. But it's better than opinions, in my personal opinion. So I think we could go with psychological safety and actual safeguards and being able to define the outcomes we want to avoid, but also the we want to have, right? So also defining what the AI will do, not just what it will bring, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Now we're moving to more philosophical questions with Laura. So, Laura, in your research, you're asking a foundational question. Who or what gets to decide when AI system influence human decision-making? So, this question is sit at the core of public accountability. So, my question to you, have we made meaningful progress answering that question, or have institutions become better at diffusing and avoiding responsibility?
I think the short answer is no. I don't think we have gotten any better. So I think to basically split up that question, so I think one of the main points that lies in that question is the problem of like AI very often very much influencing human decision making. And then also what does that mean in the context of the public sector? And I think that the implications specifically for the public sector and decision making in the public sector are actually very, very important and are not talked about enough. So I think especially in regards to the modalities that interaction through generative AI has brought up, the influence that AI can have on human decision-making has increased since the research that you were talking about, that I did, because that was pre-Gen AI times, which is now hard to even comprehend. And I think that that has just gotten more important and even more complex. So I think that if we take that, like the challenges that arise here, where we say that, oh, okay, how much of a decision is actually like comes from the human agent, like how much comes from human reasoning, intentionality, agency, etc. How much of a decision comes from that, and then how much of a decision comes from an AI? And now if we translate that to the public sector, we can still ask the question, okay, how much of an action or decision comes from the human agent, and how much comes from the AI? And especially in the public sector, there's a different kind of responsibility that we need to take into account, because public servants have a very particular role. Even just the context of public servant in itself already means a lot, right? It's a servant of the state that serves the public, basically. And they have a certain responsibility in themselves. And when we look at AI being implemented in the public sector, that responsibility does not apply in the same way. And I think that that is a bit important mismatch and an important dynamic that then arises in human-AI interaction in regards to this AI influence in the public sector. I don't know if that makes sense.
That completely makes sense. Awesome. Back to you, Oksana. So I know that you are advocating for an enabling women or female professional to become leaders in the tech sector. And many argue that this will be a foundational for inclusion to be designed into system from start. So from your perspective, Oksana, what would it take to move from a symbolic consultation to a real participatory governance process that include women and marginalized community in shaping human-centric AI systems?
It's a very big question. I'm going to try to make a short answer. So we've spoken in different sessions today, including this morning, of stakeholder engagement, right? And that's what you're referring to when you say this consultation, because we've also spoken about how this can be weaponized in a way by saying we asked people once at the beginning of the process, right? So we did the stakeholder engagement. So of course, that's not what we want. For me, a lot of the change comes from education, literacy, but also giving chances. We know that we have our own bias in how we select people for jobs, for instance. And whatever we do, we're humans, so all of us are going to feel more comfortable with people we relate to. And that can be due to gender or other things, right? But if we educate ourselves also on how we actually process, and if we educate ourselves on AI and how it works, and understanding exactly where the problems may lay, if you do not integrate people all across the life cycle, then yeah, I feel like the solution is education on that way. Also giving more chances to younger women, younger girls. I think I've seen a lot of different things happening in getting girls more towards computer science, right? Or implementing AI classes at every level of education for every student. And we have seen that it does lead to some more positive outcome. Women are more interested as grown-ups into those fields, even though that doesn't mean everyone becomes a computer scientist. But yeah, educating everyone, and then also assuming that everyone can be good at everything. But that's, you know, yeah, exactly. You're saying no, I agree. It's a hard thing to think, okay, maybe everyone can actually be good at everything if you give them the chance and they try and you see it works, right?
I mean, I think it's important. I mean, a lot of that was aimed at, and I think it's important at getting kind of more women at the table or different groups at the table in thinking about when AI is being built, right? But I think we have to take a step back and think about the ecosystem a little bit bigger, and the challenges that are systemic in it, and how AI can play into those or exacerbate them. But I mean, we're talking about, we should really take a step back to how we're even prioritizing where AI may be used, or what questions we're asking about where it can be helpful and where it can't, right? What topics even get addressed through it, not just who is actually building the system, but how we're conceiving of how AI should be employed in the public sector in particular, but generally in the ecosystem. And that involves thinking about systemic changes alongside, just the pipeline.
Awesome. So now moving to you, Laura, again. So one of the main challenges in public sector AI governance, it's the fragmentation. So a lot of ministries, a lot of departments, a lot of agencies, and often they operate in a separate mode. For example, they have different mandates and different accountability structures. So what would a whole of government approach to AI accountability look like in practice? And how can public institutions coordinate more effectively across policy, engineering, research, recruitment, and others?
It's a very big question.
All the questions are big.
I don't know whether I can fix the state problems in one answer. But I think what I, at least from my experience from working at Byte, can share is that, at least in Bavaria, the ministries work with the so-called Ressortprinzip, which basically means that each ministry is responsible for its own functionality within the ministry, right? And then the minister at the top is responsible for the ministry in itself. And that works for every single ministry individually. And obviously, when we then went to the ministries and said, hey, you want, for example, an HR platform that works for all ministries across the level, basically. The ministry said, no, we don't want that, because that means that we need to share information with the other ministries. And basically, I think that is why the digitalization project in Bavaria, but maybe also on the German state level, fails very often, because there's this working in silos, and digitalization is something that works horizontally and not vertically. And I think that is one of the big challenges that we have. So I think that is one very big thing we need to address. And then the other thing on basically answering that question is like, okay, so we need to implement an agency or like an institution that acknowledges this thinking in silos and somewhat addresses the concerns within the ministries so that they start talking to each other and start seeing like the potential of the working with each other and talking with each other. And maybe also like, okay, transparency is difficult and we don't want full transparency, but maybe a certain level of transparency is good and we need it. So I think that is what should aim for. And then on the other hand, another aspect that I think is very, very challenging is not only like making people talk to each other, but then also enabling like a framework where they can talk to each other. So I think that one of the big challenges is also like the different conceptual backgrounds people have. Now when people from the public sector meet people from startups, meet people from like big tech companies, they will all have different approaches, will have different like conceptual languages, etc. And I think that like enabling like common language on common grounds would also help, like, foster, bringing this whole or the challenges, kind of, making them smaller.
Amazing, Kathleen. Back to you. So we're always using the word or the term public interest when we want to justify AI deployment in healthcare, public service, or different areas, but still the word itself or the term itself or the concept, it remains a bit vague. So my question, what would it actually mean for an AI system to fail a public interest test, and why our government are reluctant to define that threshold clearly?
I mean, I think there's many different places at which it can fail the test, right? And I mean, one is that first we have to gauge what the public interest is, and this steps back to what I was saying at the beginning of the process, where what questions are we actually asking, what topics are we actually prioritizing, and putting resources and money and maybe development of some sort of technical system into the questions that are really the ones that that public wants, right? So in this case, you need really good, trustworthy ways of engaging with the public. And here I'll make a plug for something probably preaching to the choir here, but that we need more interdisciplinary and academic research on the topic of how to best engage with the public. So through our center, for instance, we're starting something called the Public Technology Lab, and one of the goals is to actually do more research on the best ways to interact with the public and bring them into the process of deciding what is public interest technology to us and how to best employ it in our societies. So taking a step back to prioritizing what the questions are, and then making sure you have kind of the tests and the mechanisms and the guardrails in place to constantly be checking in about what the impacts of different systems are, right? Are they biasing certain groups? Are they creating gaps where either they used to be smaller or there used to not be gaps? So, and not just doing that once and creating this kind of checkbox exercise, but coming up with real kind of back and forth methods to assess the systems as well.
Yes, Nicole, now the stage is yours.
All right, so let's move from the foundational questions, the definition questions of public interest AI, and the question like who actually sits at the table and what this means for accountability, to the question of operationalizing this accountability. I want to start with a personal example. So I worked for many years in the German Federal Foreign Office, and I started out in a very hands-on, data-driven, AI-driven crisis early warning unit preview. And I remember like in the beginning, it was a lot of data scientists. They innovated for the purpose of innovation, but there was no buy-in from the diplomats at all. And a big factor here was that they were very skeptical about the tools. They didn't understand them and they didn't trust them, and thus they didn't have any acceptance for them. So basically we innovated away from the need, and there was this cultural transformation missing here. Now, I feel accountability is really a big factor here to get to this cultural transformation. We develop like an AI ethics charter then for diplomacy, really concretely nailing down like how we want to use AI in the foreign service, you know, creating those governance, accountability mechanisms, and that helped a lot to get this acceptance and trust. And also, Oksana, I want to relate back to your point about scientific involvement, because once we included scientific communities to let the models be evaluated, you know, neutrally, basically, you know, externally, like that also helped a lot to get the acceptance and the trust for these systems and the buy-in. So I want to turn to you also for the first question, because you worked a lot on like AI ethics, but also this, like, you know, concept that we shouldn't just stay with AI ethics, but have like a very strong concept of human rights enforcement, psychology, well-being in the end, being included in the way how we govern. So I want to ask you, like, when you think of public sector use cases, application fields that are often mission critical, high impact for the public, like how would you suggest to operationalize especially human rights considerations across the whole life cycle, you know, from the procurement question, selecting vendors in the end, then to financing decisions, deploying. Could you guide us through this life cycle process, like the different decisions that are at stake here?
Okay, you're ready for a long answer. So, first, let's take a use case, because you're right, that would be much easier. Let's take a hospital. I feel like a hospital is a very life and death situation. It can go very right, can go very wrong very fast. Let's assume AI for, during COVID, right, we had a lot of AI systems for the vaccine, picking who gets the, well, not so much in Europe, but in the US. There was a lot of use cases. Now, if today you were asking me this question, we want to build an AI to know who gets the treatment first for this, whatever virus is out there, I would first say, okay, what are the regulations we have in the land, right? First things first. What are the needs we have in the land? And then, who is it for? Is it for a city? Are we talking country level? Are we scope? Then see all the potential risks by talking to the people, talk to the doctors, talk to the hospital, look into the history, look into the data, but also the experience, the lived experiences. I think that's where qualitative research is actually very good, because we might lose a lot of nuance with just data, numbers, I mean. So once you have scoped to the best of your ability and asked to the best of your ability, what should we do for whom, and what could go wrong, what could go right too, then I would get into the room with the computer scientists and say, okay, now here is the plan. Then you get to your first phases, right? So you pick the model, you try to make the best decision, you've already acknowledged the worst case, what you want to avoid, so you try to make the most informed decisions as well. Maybe you get the scientists to come in at that point, the ones doing the research on all of those things. At least you go to conferences, you ask people. Why not interviews? I'm just making everyone do a lot of research right now, but you do that kind of informed, right? The most informed you can be, I think, is the best decision you can make. And from there, a lot of testing. When it comes to life and death situation, I do believe in how pharmacy works in Europe. I don't know if you know, but there is like 3 rounds of testing, and you have a lot of benchmark, and it's hell. But at the end of the day, when you take a medication, you trust that it works, right? So if we're going to talk about life and death AI decisions, I believe we should be as strict, personal opinion. So, and once you have all this transparency, you can describe all of your process, you have tested it with the right population, you have sandboxed it, then you've done the best you can. And I would trust you as a user to do something else better later. Does that answer the question, or was that
It
far?
very much answers the question. No, that was perfect. I want to go a little bit back to the concepts. And Laura, you mentioned this already, like the concepts of responsibility and agency, you know, liability, accountability, and you research a lot on this. And oftentimes, like in policy conversations, at least that I'm having, like these get, you know, thrown into the room interchangeably. So I want to ask you, like, can you walk us through, like, in practice, you know, how these different concepts apply, especially in the public sector, especially in, like, you know, mission critical contexts like in peace and security, and maybe a follow-up question like, if something goes wrong in the public sector and this has real bad consequences for citizens, for the wider public, not only of that country but internationally maybe even, like, who's accountable?
Unfortunately, I can mainly talk only about Bavaria because that's where I have the practical experience. But in Bavaria, when we talk about responsibility, and this is something that I also only learned through working at Byte, in Bavaria, you differentiate between, and this is actually also part of the Bavarian constitution. So if you look into the Bavarian constitution, you can see two different concepts. You can see Verantwortung, responsibility, and you can see Zuständigkeit, which is basically, and like I've tried to come up with a good word in English for it, but it's quite difficult. I think the word that probably fits most in English is role responsibility, but like broken down to make it less complex. So responsibility in a like more complex sense also involves like intentionality, agency, etc. And role responsibility in this sense, Zuständigkeit in German, doesn't necessarily involve these concepts. And in the context of the Bavarian public sector and decision-making in the public sector, we very, very often talk about Zuständigkeit. And when I kind of came across this differentiation for the very first time, I thought this was mind-blowing to me, because I thought, you know what, in Bavaria we talk about Zuständigkeit. And as I mentioned, this is also part of the constitution. People are zuständig and not verantwortlich. So they are like less responsible to some extent, which then also has implications for agency. So people, when we talk about the public sector in itself and the structure of decision making in the public sector, the people at the bottom, let's say, are only zuständig, and then like they have role responsibility. So they don't necessarily have agency within their decision making. So the decision is basically decoupled from the agency, which obviously like has important implications then again for like how these people would interact with AI, and then what on a broader level that means for responsibility and the whole construct. So I think, and then the responsibility basically only comes at the top layer. So when we talk about like Amtschefs or like the people underneath the ministers, and then the ministers themselves, and then like higher levels, etc. So I think that is something that we kind of need to consider when we talk about human AI interaction in the public sector. And when we talk about like taking responsibility or liability into consideration in this construct, because the way the system works now and the way concepts are defined within the system now, this does not match with how we would usually take human AI interaction to work.
Absolutely.
I want to add something before moving to the next question. So I think we should consider what after redefining the term accountability. So for example, I'm from Sudan, and my country it's now in a serious war. And this war it's between military and also militia. And this war it's funded, for example, by Emirate. So they are using both sides. They are using AI for killing each other, and definitely there's a lot of innocents who got killed in this war. But we know who is accountable. But the question is, what after we define the term accountability? Nothing happened. We just go to conferences, we speak about accountability, responsibility, but in the real world, there is no implementation for this concept, and no one held accountable.
Yeah.
You want to respond?
I don't know. Does anyone have an answer? I think like so. One of the main issues here is this regulatory gap that we very often experience. So, I mean, tech goes super fast, and like ethics kind of limps behind, and we're like, oh yeah, we've thought about this. And I mean, thank God some of the concepts like are like we can reuse. So a lot of the debate around AI agents that we have now, a lot of the topics that we find there have already been around since the robot ethics wave in the early 2010s. And so we can kind of fall back on some concepts, but still, even though we have the pace of technology, then philosophy and ethics is kind of lagging behind a little bit, but then the regulatory gap is what happens in between, and this is where the ethical considerations obviously get turned into practice and into liability, and I think that ethics kind of bridges this gap a little bit, but ethics doesn't give us the liability aspects in that sense. I think you wanted to add.
Oh, sorry.
I think it relates well to the point I was going to make based off of Laura's, that AI may bring some new things to our consideration, but what you are describing and what you're describing is an extremely good example of that. It's not the first time we've dealt with bureaucratic complexity, in this world, and it's not the first time we've dealt with complex supply chains and complex ecosystems that are hard to regulate. So there's a lot to be said for looking at places where we have tested policies and we have seen what's worked and what hasn't worked. So before I came to Technical University of Munich, I was working heavily on looking at mining communities and regulation in the mining industry. Also a very complex supply chain issue with a lot of problems with transparency and accountability. And there's a lot of different efforts that have been made to deal with things like accountability by, for instance, in the case of South Africa, they put in place a lot of regulation to say we need to do more in these communities. We need to make it extremely transparent what the contracts are between the government and the mining companies, for instance. And so they officially made all these processes transparent and open. But try contacting the Freedom of Information Act people at the Department of Mines in South Africa, because you will be waiting. I'm still waiting. I think it was 10 years ago I was working on this research, and they still haven't sent me the documents that I requested, right? And so while noble efforts to put these things in place happen, there are things that happen either in public administration or bureaucracy, or even just in how communities react to the type of policies you put in place on the ground. And there are lessons to be learned from other places into how you could make these things more streamlined or work better through bureaucracy. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can look to other examples as well.
And if I can jump in on that, I'm going to kind of zoom out of the AI, of the AI topic in itself and of any kind of specific use cases or places such as Sudan. But if we think about accountability at the end of the day in democracies, it's when people rile up and say, we disagree, be accountable, right? I believe that that's actually what we were saying earlier, democracy is not efficient. Depends on where you define what's efficiency. I believe efficiency is when the population still can go to whoever and say, we disagree. And I feel like with AI and public interest, that's exactly what public interest is. Do you want to jump in now? Jump in now.
No, you go.
Go for it.
No. But I think, answering to that, I think one of the main aspects that, and this ties very nicely into what you just said, we need transparency. And transparency is just something that when we look at AI and decision-making, public sector decision-making in general, transparency is something that is mandated. It has to, decisions have to be transparent because that's how we democratically legitimize decision-making. But I don't know whether it's actually happening to a level where you could hold people accountable or responsible.
So talking about transparency, I think it's also the problem of it's cool to be transparent, but who's going to read those terms of use? So it's about understandability. It's not about, oh, look, we put it out somewhere. It's about here is exactly what's happening in a language that my baker can understand. Right? Because not everyone has to be a highly educated computer scientist or whatever we do here, right? So I think what we're missing in the how do you make accountability is how do you really allow democracy to happen? That, sorry, I came up with a bigger question, not an answer at all.
I think there is an answer we've seen from other places, and that's that you have to support civil society.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe not everyone has the time or skills or whatever to read those terms of service or comb through the thousands of documents they put out when in the name of transparency that actually make it harder sometimes to sift through application. But if you have well-funded, well-protected, and trusted civil society, then there are actors and people and expertise that can be lent to these causes.
And going back to the concept of educate as many people as you can to the level that is actually necessary, not the one we think is the best, right? Look, we fixed society.
It was amazing just listening to all of you. No, but it was amazing. Thanks, Dalia, for already connecting us to the international level a little bit, because that was our discussion topic, like to wrap this conversation up, basically, because like in the end, and I want to turn to you, Caitlin, because it's really about this tension when we talk about international AI governance between the global standards we have, especially in human rights law, and then making or developing context-sensitive approaches to AI governance. Now, Caitlin, you worked on both sides, actually, so a lot on cross-regional AI ethics with a focus on Africa, the Ubuntu ethics in AI healthcare, health AI, but also like championing initiatives at the multilateral level for like a global binding human rights convention on AI and human rights. So I want to ask you, like, where would you draw the line between like those necessary global baseline standards that we all need to somehow agree on, and then those context-sensitive approaches that really, you know, focus on the local political, cultural, and legal realities on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's one way to do it, but the way that I think has been useful in the processes we've done with the, when looking at the case of human rights and AI, is to bring in a lot of voices early on, which is what we did with our convention on human rights and AI, and to make that open and have people opt in and try to get as global perspective as we can, make a concerted effort. It takes longer. It does cost more resources, both mentally and monetarily. But I think there was a lot that once we had people in the room, that actually that baseline wasn't, I mean, it wasn't as contentious as I thought we may have been. It's just that those voices weren't necessarily in the room, and there was actually a lot we could agree on to kind of start from something, to start with a draft. And then to pass that on to more people and get more feedback, and to, I mean, there are compromises made along the way and prioritizations that happen and don't. But I think starting from that base, we actually found a lot of common territory that everyone could agree on, and therefore allowed us to set, you know, some sort of global baseline, at least on fundamental things that we felt were really, really key to the human rights debate. So I think the process is really important. I think it's key to actually coming up with the baseline. But I think on terms of the other question, the local context, I think one thing that kind of has been an underlying assumption through a lot of what we said is that we are operating in places that have strong governance system. In the session I was in before, the security session, you know, we were talking about post-conflict and conflict settings, and a lot of places where you can't make that assumption, where we don't necessarily have the time and resources. Even with your case earlier on in the hospital setting, you know, it all sounded great, but when you're talking about a pandemic, we don't have the time or resources or necessarily the governance structures in place to make all those decisions, right? So how do we take that baseline, and then I think it's key to adapt it and to think about how we maybe can still get at some of these accountability issues, even given contexts where we may not have this assumption of good governance that we have, luckily for us, here.
Quick follow-up question on this, especially on the Munich Convention. So I understand, like, this is basically like a process design question, like to, you know, have this inclusivity by design in such global processes. Now with the convention, like, why would you say, do we need such a binding global framework for human rights data and AI? And like, I don't know, are you hopeful in the current geopolitical debate, especially to get something like this through, for example, in the Human Rights Council, or not? Like, how long would it take us? But maybe start, why do we need it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we can, again, I think it's in some ways, hopefully, the bindingness of it may not be the 100% end goal, but to show that there is this common ground that I think the majority of the world can agree upon, I think is a really important step. Whether that be a legally binding convention in the end or some other form that it take. I don't think again, I think the process is important in that step. I think if we do have some sort of binding convention, we'll come back to a lot of the complexity of the accountability options anyways, right? But I think the recognition, and we've seen this in other places, that the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of the AI and how many countries they got to commit to signing off on those, I mean, that was a huge step in itself. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree. We need this basically like global sign, commitment to human rights. Like in the meantime, I want to final question to you, Oksana, and then we open it up for audience Q&A. I want to ask you, like in the meantime, you know, while we are working on big multilateral treaties or binding frameworks, because you know those take time, I guess. I want to ask you, like, on the operational level, you know, there is a lot of discussion of bias in AI systems, you know, especially from global north tech hubs, you know, and the question, like, that they are replicated in the global south. At the same time, when you look at the GDPR, there is this kind of, you know, concept of, you know, right to opt out, or right to not be subjected. We have European Court of Justice rulings that say, like, there is this right to, you know, transparency, basically, explanation, like how an AI system is deployed upon you. But oftentimes, like, especially with Global South communities or marginalized communities overall, like, they don't really have this right to opt out. They are affected by the AI systems developed in the North, and then they cannot opt out. It's also very difficult to get transparent answers from, you know, tech companies to your question, like how an AI system was deployed upon you. So I want to ask you any operational guidance, like what we can do across the AI lifecycle to mitigate this bias, but also mitigate the impact, the negative impact on marginalized communities globally. Big question, sorry.
I'm looking at the time. I've been the timekeeper today, if you haven't seen me run around. Okay, so I think globally, I don't have a good solution for you except build globally, you know? Because when we talk about bias, we usually talk about the data set, but it's not just about the data set, and I think most of us in here know that. It's about the entire life cycle and the choices we make at every stage of building an AI. I usually take the example of the Schufa. If you're not familiar with it, it's a credit scoring that we have in Germany. Now imagine that an AI system is in charge of scoring someone to know if they can get a new house or a new apartment. How do you make the decision of first which algorithm you use for that? What are the values you're going to implement in that algorithm as being important, to which level, why? If you have a very homogeneous group, you might miss a lot of red flags in there. And now if I tell you there is a person who stopped working for 1 year to 3 years, maybe once, twice, 3 times in their lifetime. So maybe the AI system is going to flag that, oh, then this person is not reliably hired. Or maybe if you had someone from the get-go saying, wait, isn't that a parental leave? Maybe that would then be flagged for what it is. Of course, this is a very simplistic example, but it's just to give you a feeling of decisions are not just about the data and an AI is trained on. It's also about who builds it, how do we test it, how do we then calibrate it, what do we decide is the appropriate, accurate decision, right? So globally, if you want to align with everyone's values, good luck. Now, if we adapt, maybe, of course, there is something to do with the data as well. Think about representativeness, or at least acknowledge the bias in the data sets. That works very well. You were talking about privacy as a tension point, and you're right. Privacy is a big tension point with this representativeness in the data sets. Again, I don't have a solution except look at the population you're talking to and see where their value lies about this. So on the global scale, I think we can have similar methodologies, but I don't believe we can have exactly the same AI systems for everyone that will treat everyone the same. Honestly, I think this is a utopia. Also, do we really want that? Because I think we all want to adapt it to our own cultures, things, right? I hope that answered the question in a very short time.
Yeah, we have only 10 seconds, the last question in 10 seconds. So each one of you will have 5 seconds to answer this question. And this is imagination question. So let's say in the next few years, Kathleen, you are the head of ITU. You are the Minister of Technology, for example. And Oxen, you are Germany counselor. So, so what will be the first step or the one? You have to mention a single step that you will take to align AI with public interest. A single step.
I would define public interest.
Okay.
You took mine. Sorry.
I think it's all about funding. I think it's about figuring out where the funding needs to go in order to promote the right interests.
I would probably change the way public procurement works, at least in Germany at the moment, because it very much excludes like startups and smaller companies, which then again creates this like polarization, and I think we need to break out of that.
Nice. Now we can have 1-2 questions from the audience.
Thank you again for the panel and the wonderful panel. I think you discussed there at the very end that funding is an important thing. And here we're sitting in Europe, we're seeing acceleration of obviously CapEx spending across the industry on AI. But when we look at GDP growth, at least in Europe, we're looking at less than 1%. We're looking at inflation above 2%. Where would the funding come from for public investment in AI right now? What would have to be traded off to get the money, to get the resources, whether it's collaboration, participation, et cetera, in order to really get the public interest, if you will, accelerated?
Great question. Who wants to take it?
I mean, there always seems to be funding for a lot of things. I think it's just about prioritizing it, right? So reimagining, I mean, where we can get different funding from. Even at the German level, they're supporting different startup initiatives and innovation and breakthrough innovation, for instance, at the German federal level, and they have to prioritize public interest innovation in that space as much as they can. They can't do everything, right? I mean, it's shape and support, right? It's not, you can't run the whole ecosystem. We have one here and then. Go ahead.
So I would like to thank you, all of you, for the diversity of topic that you have already addressed on this panel, but I would like to refer back to the point that was mentioned by Dalia about the usage of AI in international and civil conflict situations. And then I have just heard the comment about the regulatory gaps. And in my opinion or perspective, I would say like regulatory gaps, it exists when it comes to addressing the regulation in terms of the national perspective or national level, because AI intersects with different types of law and areas of law. But when it comes to the international level, I think international law gives international institutions much of freedom. Because when we come to the sources of international law, we have different things like treaties and customary international law, and at the end of the day, we have scholarly writings, which is literature or key literature. And when we look at this literature, we find that they have addressed accountability, and they have already identified it in many terms. So this gives international institutions like the ICC, International Criminal Court, the freedom to address this. So what I would like to say is that, yes, we need to invest into civil societies so that we can bridge this regulatory gap on the national level. But when it comes to the international level, don't you think that we need to look somewhere else, which is the silence of the international community that doesn't want to interfere into this? And how can we fix this? Thank you.
I have more questions than answers to this. I'm sorry, I'm more a researcher than anything else. So when it comes to reacting, I agree with you that there is, of course, a need and something that's not being done. And how to fix it, I'm not sure. But I have questions about where does reacting stop and getting too involved start? Is there such things as too involved? And how do we define those boundaries? And that's a real question, a genuine question of what, should we also do a public interest study on the populations of how much do you want the international crowd to get involved, Of course there is some level for sure, but the question, I'm really unsure how to implement when the boundaries are not set. But again, that's more questions than answers, right? And I do believe something should be done.
And then, if I might add something to that, I think even if we look at the case of, okay, so there are boundaries in place and there are certain laws in place that supposedly regulate how we as a world, societies work with each other and live with each other, there's still actors that completely go against anything that would be considered morally okay. So just in the beginning of this year, I mean, in the first week of this year, somebody abducted another country's president, and now that person also publicly said that this person is acting according to their own morality. I mean, so we have these regulations in place and in supposed democracies that work according to laws that have been set in stone, and still there are people going completely against it. So I don't know whether how this reacting to something and setting boundaries, how we can define that.
I'm just going to answer a very French thing. I think we should really just all go fix it. Accountability to me in that case should really come also as a bottom-up situation, not just a top-down, because you're right, the Hague has been failing.
Yeah, I think I can just add something because Mohamed, you are a judge, Egyptian judge, and I think it's also the reaction, it's more case dependent. So for example, when we are talking about war, because the whole world is involved in this kind of war, and there's this war economy, no one paying attention to this kind of disasters. But for example, in Egypt right now, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a strong regulations for AI and harassment. So for example, as a female, if I faced any kind of blackmailing with AI videos or whatever, if I'm in Egypt, I can just go to the police and I can report case. But if the same thing happened to me in Sudan, for example, or in Yemen, no one cares about you. So most of the girls, they committing suicide because they know no one will care about them. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the case in Egypt, it's now completely different, right?
In Egypt, so far, we don't have law that is applicable on AI, but we are trying to use what is called the analogy in law. So we use this kind of enforcement power that is given to the police department so that we can use anything that would be used as harassment. And then we extend the law more further to ensure that we are actually creating a kind of deterrence to these kind of practices so it cannot go further into the community. So that's what we have. But in Egypt, I know that we are working on a legislation for the AI, and probably it will be built on the EU AI Act, which is something I am curious about.
Okay, so I guess that's a really meaningful discussion. I would suggest that maybe we can continue it at the reception and in an informal way. With that, I would like to thank you so much for your attention for this final panel for today. And I will now hand over to Oxane for some final remarks on wrapping up the day, but also some logistical details.
I'm not going to hold you here very long. Just saying that the reception is starting in the foyer. You're welcome to all the food and drinks, and we will not throw you out before 8 or 8:30. And otherwise, tomorrow morning we start, I believe, at 9:30. And so you're welcome to come back for 9:30 tomorrow after tonight. Thank you very much for your attention again, and congratulations.